Welcome to Council's Judgment, Episode 2. I am your somewhat belligerent and old host, Tyler Woolley. Joining me today, we have, with the hundreds of views we got on YouTube and new audio, Spencer Kanaka. How are you doing today, Spencer?
That's right. Hooked up the actual microphone, probably sound a lot clearer.
And also, we have returning co-host Sasha Christensen,
Graphic
right?
design is my passion and my prison.
Yes, you'll see the memes are well with Sasha this week for sure. So, we have a pretty cool episode for you this week, building off our set review last week, thanks to the kind comments, the kind criticisms, and constructive criticisms we got. I really appreciate the feedback and the views on the video. But today we're going to be doing something a little different and diving into a very unique tournament structure that, as far as I know, is quite localized to Victoria and the Victoria Highlander scene, which is the 2023 year-end top 8, which is tracked all throughout the year. The gist of it is, if you win a Monday night Highlander tournament at Yellow Jacket Comics and Collectibles, you get 1 point. And at the end of the year, the top 8 point getters or winners play off in top 8 style. I believe it's double elimination, but I could be wrong. Correct me.
Single elim.
Single M.
Single elim tournament that is broadcast, occasionally broadcast on Loaded and Ready Run or streamed. Really cool event, very prestigious, and kind of the thing everyone's kind of gunning for when you're playing at the beginning of the year. So we're going to talk about, coincidentally, 2 of our 3 members are qualified for this tournament and are going to talk a little bit about their preparation, how they prepare for a unique and very small metagame, and how you kind of can try to adjust your deck building and your potential decks you can play in the range of those based on metagaming for such a small event.
Yeah, and it's also I think, a really good introduction to new players who don't have a good sense of how to metagame for larger scale tournaments like GPs or RCQs. This is kind of the super boiled down version of that, and how you can actually very concretely identify what the meta is and then build a deck or identify a deck to attack it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any conversation on metagaming is always going to be helpful regardless of the format, because a lot of it is just kind of paying attention to your surroundings when you're going to Magic tournaments. And you can obviously pick up on a lot of patterns and a lot of deck building decisions that higher tier of player is going to make. So, really quickly, we're just going to run over kind of the recap of the Yellow Jacket top 8. So, just as I said, you get 1 point awarded for the weekly Highlander win. Top 8 point goers, point earners go on to play in the year end top 8. Top 8 placement determines play draw. So, again, if you have the most wins, which is our beloved Highlander dad, Noel Robin, this year, you're going to be on the play all throughout the top 8. It kind of goes all the way down. And Sasha, how do tiebreakers work? Because I know there was a number of players at like 3 wins.
Yeah, so whenever tiebreakers occur, so first of all, you can either have players higher up in the rankings that have the same number of points. Those players will just roll dice to determine play draw if they happen to play each other.
Oh,
In the
okay.
in the context of this year, we actually had to do a playoff because we had quite a few players who earned 3 wins this year, and they had to do a mini tournament. And from that mini tournament, we got the bottom half of the standings for this top 8.
Gotcha. So in that context, then once if 2 players play that had the same amount of wins, they're just determining it randomly. There's no like last winner gets to be on the play kind of thing.
Exactly. The only way where it changes is from that playoff tournament. So the fifth through eighth seed are ordered based on the results of that mini tournament.
Gotcha. Cool. So then the first round is best out of 3, just like a normal. The semis and the finals are best of 5. So really trying to take out variance as much as you can. breaking serve really not back breaking as much as it would be in a best out of 3. You kind of have a little bit more time. We'll go over kind of when we're chatting maybe what that can change in terms of your mulliganing or deck building decisions. Untimed rounds, but you're still, like any Magic tournament, very encouraged to make your decisions at a decent pace, especially if you're playing on stream, and open deck lists. So your opponent is going to get a copy of your deck list at the beginning of every round, and given that review period that players are now given at the higher levels of Magic.
One thing that we may want to touch on is just specifically the impact of playing multiple rounds of best of 5 and the impact of open deck lists in deck selection, because certainly one of the considerations when you're going to larger competitive tournaments is if you're going to bring a higher variance deck, it can often be subsidized by your opponent not knowing what you're on. Say you show up with Storm and your opponent doesn't know to mulligan to their 3 pieces of hand attack. That's usually a game 1 that you've won a great deal of. And similarly for best of 5, if you have to beat this higher variance deck, it's going to be harder to achieve that best of 5 win versus a best of 3.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do really like that aspect of it as well, just because if it's a bad matchup, it's a bad matchup. And you do see clean 3-0 sweeps from time to time, but there has kind of developed some really good best of 5 matches that go the distance throughout the years. So from here, we're just going to chat a little bit about how to metagame and how to prepare for a tournament like this. Just gonna pass it off to Spencer to kind of kick us off here.
Yeah, so I think with this tournament, unlike, when you go to a GP or a PTQ or, another sort of larger tournament circuit where you can kind of metagame for an expected metagame, and then you try and maybe try and level 1, level 2, level 3, where you're trying to okay, well, what's the winner's metagame going to be versus what's my potential field that I'm going to be facing. So unlike a lot of those ones where there's many other considerations at play, this one there's almost uniquely a known metagame where I'd say 4 to 6 of the players have which one we'll talk about in a moment, have pretty defined archetypes or specialists. And there's a couple people with larger ranges, but even then you can almost target them to certain types of decks. So for this, it's not so much oh, well, I need to get through, 40% of the decks of the field and then win a winner's meta game. There's also, you can almost say okay, well, I can pick a deck that's pretty good for these 6 or 7 decks, and I'm very likely high percentage to face them and not get dirted out by a random deck. I also think that a lot of effort goes into metagaming in a lot of different formats. And in Canlander, although metagaming is important, I think mostly metagaming has to do with specific deck choices. Obviously, we don't have access to sideboards. So choices within your deck are your essentially pre-sideboarding. So, for example, when there's a lot of combo heavy decks in the field, even if you're a person who typically plays a blue control or blue tempo deck, or you play a hate bear deck, you might slot in a couple cards that are, maybe effect searching, counter magic, or hate bear. I also think that with this metagame and how I've always approached metas, from back in the SCG days as well, is that your comfort matters a lot. Reps with a deck honestly matter more than the percentages that you'll get in making a better meta choice. If you've played a deck hundreds of times and know many of those matches, that is worth more than the switching to a new deck that may be slightly better in that matchup particularly, but that you do not have the reps with. Because particularly with best of 5 and the way that our format works without sideboards, aggressive mulliganing to what the cards that you need and a fundamental understanding of the matchup are super important. And you only get that with reps.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point, and probably more so than grinders in modern or even legacy. Obviously standard, the main kind of tournament circuit series, people do jump decks quite a bit at the higher levels and kind of are looking for the edges and looking for the best new tech. And with Highlander, I think that exists a lot less, and I do think more than those formats, deck familiarity and format familiarity are rewarded at a very high level.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a catch-22 where the ability to tune any deck for a metagame is really reduced just because we are 100 card singleton. So that really does incentivize, if you want to attack a metagame, you kind of have to choose a deck that's going to do that. You can't choose I can't sleeve up my lands deck and then make it good against Storm without like wildly compromising it against all those other matchups. By the same token, just because of how math works in the number of non-land cards in a Highlander deck, unique copies of non-land cards in Highlander decks, versus 60 card 4 of copies, it means we have like 7 times as many cards in our deck. And those cards have important interactions and they come up a lot less, and their interactions are a lot more varied. Oftentimes, just like good Magic fundamentals and good format knowledge can bridge you some of the way, but understanding your placement in the matchup is really important, and you can't really develop that off instinct alone. It does actually require a lot of reps.
I just want to add one further caveat to that when I'm speaking about comfort within like your deck archetype. And that doesn't necessarily mean like just a deck like with 100 cards that you have picked or 95 plus cards picked. Like often I'm kind of referring to like your comfort range. Certain players gravitate towards combo decks, but they can, switch the colors of that deck pretty easily. Or if someone's familiar with playing blue mid-range, the differences between like Jeskai Green are like not immense, like too immense to overcome. Like you'll have a lot of the familiarity of the cards and like maybe feels of the matchups and stuff like that. So it's mostly just a familiarity with like your own range as a player as well. So you don't just make like I'm gonna drop Timebolt even though I've never played a Academy or a Paradox deck before,
Yeah, 100%. I think the tuning that you do is kind of within the sub-archetypes of Highlander, where like, oh, you may be like a mid-range pilot, but are you playing like what 4-color combination, what 3-color combination, or like which Gaia's Cradle deck are you showing up with this week? In your case, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, and I also think, for example, locally Jack Hanukkah, who won the previous year with D&T, just watching him aggressively mulligan what would normally be keepable hands. And like, there's been times like I've watched him play and I'm like, oh, that was a keepable 6, and he'll mulligan to 5. And he's like, well, in this matchup, I need this on turn 2, or I need fast mana. And if I don't see those cards, I mulligan, even if it's 4 spells, 3 lands.
Exactly. That kind of discipline you don't often see, and that really only comes with format knowledge. One of the decks I've been playing a lot has been the Doomsday Breach deck, and the thing that I've really learned is you cannot keep a hand that's just cantrips. You have to have at least one tutor in it, and it usually doesn't matter what that tutor is. It can get Black Lotus, it can get one piece of the combo, but you need to have a minimum of one tutor to keep the hand, regardless of how good the other cards are.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points and kind of lead us into our further discussion here. So let's go on to what we're looking at. And so this is kind of, obviously we don't know decks certain. We are taking educated guess and kind of discussing around pilots' ranges. Maybe they all bring Time Vault. We don't know. Based on the three of us, do have a fairly good idea of the pilots are comfortable playing and what we believe they will be. So we've got first place, 6 wins, Noel Robin. Second and third at 5 wins, Sasha and Robin the Godfather Sorensen. Fourth at 4 wins, Spencer. And then 5th through 8th, which are all 3 wins, and got in as a result of that playoff. Jason Jobin, Thomas, someone fill me in Thomas's
Simmons.
last name. Thank you. Jacob Varro and Greg Van Horn. So we're just going to take a quick peek in reverse order at kind of where we're at, thinking what decks each pilot's going to play, and then we're going to have more of an extended breakdown looking at the top 4 finishers, just because we have more personal insight maybe. So starting with 8th, we've got Burnmaster, Greg Van Horn. 3 wins this year. All 3 wins with mono red or red with a very, very light green, maybe black, one of them. I don't think so though, but just we're talking 1 drops and 2 drops, maybe 2, 3 drops, very low to the ground and very punishing. Red deck wins style is what Greg has been playing throughout the year. Probably the most dedicated red pilot in the Victoria meta, I'd say, hey?
100%. He is definitely the cult master of the Burn Cabal.
I just want to talk a little bit about Mono Red as like embodied the RDW Sly form, where it's a very like mathematical game. Just like his discipline to like the CMC costs of cards and like, being able to evaluate a card essentially on its like low mana value compared to most mid-range players that don't necessarily operate that way. They're more looking at card quality in a different sort of vacuum. I think red as archetype has consistently performed well in multiple metas for as long as Canlanders existed. Its primary advantage is that it's consistent. And I think in a tournament like this, a lot of players kind of tip their noses a little bit to red, like they do in every single competitive format. But the numbers are there, and this deck is extremely consistent, and it's particularly well suited to fighting against decks with greedy mana bases because it just has free wins.
Yeah, and I think that really stands out if you do evaluate red decks side by side when, I know Greg has worked quite a bit with Trenton throughout the year. You'll say, oh, why aren't you playing like Fable or 3-drop X or, different things? Just, they're very disciplined. They, as you said, they're looking at the game as like each of these cards represents 2.25 damage and it has to do that or I'm in trouble. I think that's a really cool way to go about deck building in a larger scale format where you're going to have to play some pretty crummy cards to get to that number. But, I've sat down across from Greg a few times this year and it's scary, man. It's not, you're always in constant pressure, even if he mulls to 5 or 6 or is on the draw. Like, you're never at, 16 when you die or something. Like, it's always a very tight game, and I do really admire and appreciate the way that they've constructed their deck.
I am a famous red hater. I don't care for the deck. I don't care playing it. I have no respect for it in general. I think there are other things you could put in to make it better. But that being said, I lose to this deck. So I have played plenty of matches where I've lost to Greg over the years, and the deck does have the kind of consistency that can punish your inconsistent decks, and it's probably like the best at filling that niche of any of the decks in our format.
Absolutely. So in 7th, we've got Thomas, who's I'd say kind of the king and the arbiter of 4-color greed this year, in my opinion. Playing a lot of Seeker Walk, mostly 4-color, no red, and also Mossy Jeskai or Wet Naya, depending on how you prefer it. He's a big proponent of playing powerful spells in your Ancestral Recall deck. Pretty great strategy. I don't think I've beaten Thomas once this year. The decks he's playing are generally quite good against the junk I'm trying to line up. I think he's a very tight player. Most likely one of these two decks. Both are very powerful, fairly consistent options. Especially 4-color Jeskai with the amount of cantrips and just kind of pure card advantage and card availability power that the deck presents.
I do think Thomas, just in terms of a meta-analysis, is much more likely to opt for a Jeskai green pile. He has played Seeker Walk in the past, and I know he's relatively fond of the deck. I also know that he often beats himself up about punting with it, and that happens every so often. And in the context of a stream top 8, I suspect he'll defer to the deck that he's much more comfortable with, which would be 4-color Jeskai green. Just to be clear, his version of the deck really does fill a role much closer to historical blue-white decks. This is the deck that does play Mystic Sanctuary. He has played like 5-mana dragons in it before. It's very much like I'm going to go over the top of other mid-range decks kind of control, but it does mean that it can get punished sometimes on the low end, to the point where he actually feels that he has a bad matchup against decks like Mono Red and has included some cards like Pyroclasm to deal with that.
Next, everybody's favorite right here. We've got the Lands Thoughtlash Oracle Master, Jacob Varro. I think we're pretty safe to say this deck Jacob will be playing. I know we got 2 wins very early in the year. I think I started playing in March, and he already had 2 wins with the deck. Very cool, very innovative deck, and kind of the only person to get Lands Pile to work this year.
Who know that you only needed to mash Thassa's Oracle into the existing lands decks as a combo finish to make the deck sort of viable.
Yeah, exactly. Who could have predicted? So just for those of you not familiar, the lands decks in the format generally are revolving around Fast Bond with Strip Mine, Glacial Chasm, Life from the Loam, Wrenn and 6, like lots of ways to recur Strip Mine and Wasteland. However, Jacob's kind of adds a few sub-themes throughout the year, and a lot of them based around enchantments, Enlightened Tutor, Idyllic Tutor packages that finish with the combo of Thought Lash and Thassa's Oracle to instantly win the game. I can say you never really know what cards are potentially going to come out of that deck, having played against it a couple times, because Jacob's definitely one to kind of try out new cards, and I think this is a really cool deck, and I hope that's what he brings, just because it is one of the few like really unique archetypes.
I'd be surprised to see him not bring this deck. I mean, I actually think of it, his deck started out as more of an Enchantress deck that had a lands combo package within it, and then eventually like turned to the Thassa's Oracle as a finisher, and then it just leans so heavily on the lands themes. I think that at times I'd say it's more of an Enchantress deck than a lands deck, but it's definitely kind of three semi-archetypes bound into one. But I find that often like lands and Enchantress tend to go together because people want to play Tabernacle and they want to be able to ramp.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And one of the things this deck does really well is it both forces fair creature decks to play on this entirely different axis, because it does not really interact with the board in a substantive way. It's not playing as many removal spells, and it's really wanting to put things like Glacial Chasm onto the battlefield to just invalidate opponents' board states, wanting to slow their development with things like Tabernacle, and then eventually assembling some kind of combo. And I will just note for listeners at home the interesting Courser of Crucifix / look at the top of your deck cards and Thought Lash, because what it lets you do is by looking at the top of your deck, you can guarantee mill cards off of Thought Lash automatically until you find Thassa's Oracle. You will draw Thassa's Oracle for the turn and then exile the rest of your deck with Thought Lash. So that's one of the interesting combos that people don't fully expect out of this deck, don't realize that Courser of Crucifix and cards like Augur of Autumn can fill that void.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to seeing Jacob in the top 8. I think the games will be interesting one way or the other for sure. Moving on to Jason Jobin, Token Master. Believe didn't pick up his first win till maybe like August or September, and reeled off 3 fairly consecutive wins with like multiple finals appearances in a row as well. Really kind of found his stride with Mardu tokens, and switching between Naya tokens, Mardu tokens, and 4-color tokens. So pretty similar in terms of how those decks are set up and what they're wanting to do. He is the Mox Master, I will say. I think there's very few games that were kind of like clutch finals or get to the finals matches where I didn't see him with a Mox in play on turn 1, and his deck takes great advantage of the fast mana to develop very quick board states that snowball and get out of hand.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here and say, first of all, big kudos to Jason for really pioneering this archetype. And what he's hit on is this really interesting combination that's really frustrating to play against, where he has these kind of dinky token creators that really do make people's removal a lot worse. And then he has a whole suite of cards that are both removal checks in the form of like Rabble Master and Impakal, cards that just get out of hand on their own, and other cards that, if there is an existing board presence, will honestly just end the game outright on their own. Cards like Broadside Bombardiers being able to remove blockers and just to win the board state on its own. Gut is like low-key, I think, one of the better cards in the format that people don't recognize, and it is really maximized out of this deck. Also, just Winota, like, you have a lot of token generators, and you have just enough number of humans in this deck that you can consistently trigger it, and you have the black to tutor it as well through things like Tainted Pact if he gets access to that, though I believe he's now on 4th instead of it.
Yeah, I would expect 4th to be in this deck over most, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I lost to Jason twice in the finals in 2 of his 3 wins. Going forward, like in the local metagame, you're going to have to respect this deck. I think it's quite powerful. As you said, another kind of very unique take on a couple color combinations, and a scary deck that I think is super dependent on getting your fast mana draws, but I think more so than a deck like Naya or any deck with green in it, because you obviously don't have access to the elves and the hierarchs to kind of develop your game plan early without your Mox draws. Regardless, scary deck and attacks from a very different axis than what people's removal suites. Not a lot of sweepers in our meta over the last 6 months, and Jason definitely took full advantage of that. So now we've got the second and third place, and kind of group Sasha and Robin together here. Sasha is, he's a greedy fellow. He likes to play a lot of colors, and he likes to play combo. That's how I would explain you. I think Robin more so. I think Robin, out of anyone in this tournament, it's going to be a little tricky to put him on a deck. But if I had to put money on it, it would be that he'd play Storm. But I think he probably has. I think these two players have the widest range of any players in terms of what they could bring. So I'll let Sasha kind of.
Yeah, like for reference for these slides, me and Spencer had the advantage that our deck selection and our deck ranges are very similar to two other pilots. Me and Robin, we have a pretty wide range of decks that we both can play from a mechanical standpoint, but we're also just comfortable with. And I'd say on the upper end of both of those power spectrums, we really do oscillate between these kinds of blue-based mid-range decks. Robin's more recently tooled around with more 3-color decks, but he also registered a 4-color blue mid-range deck at the finals last year, or for the year-end last year. We're also both people who like registering Black Lotus in tournaments and winning with that. He tends to prefer the Underworld Breach Lotus without Doomsday. I tend to prefer it with. The one thing that I can definitively say for our deck selection is we will include Brainstorm in our deck. I think either of us showing up without that card are pretty much zero at this point in time. But yeah, certainly in deck selection, it'll likely be somewhere in those two ranges, but there's some off-the-wall options that we can get into later. Honestly, when prepping, it's just figuring out the right 4-color mid-range deck for this meta, or if I want to gamble. And if Robin wants to gamble, we'll choose Storm instead.
I can't let this go. Sasha and Robin are both going to think that they're going to play a Breach or a Doomsday deck. They're going to ponder it, and they will want to. And their heart will tell them to. But if they think about it, they'll end up playing an Omnath deck or an Omniscitive deck. They just can't help themselves. They think Mix Caboose is too good.
Yeah,
I think there's a 0% chance that both of them don't register Black Lotus. I think it's possible one of them does not, but I'd put a large amount of imaginary dollars on at least one of these two individuals registering Black Lotus.
I bet that neither will register Black Lotus, and I'm willing to bet 3 random packs of Magic cards right
Deal.
now.
The first podcast bet. No, sorry,
Perfect.
let's do this in a proper gentleman's way and say 3 Monday Night Highlander buy-ins.
Deal.
All right.
All right, can I get on this? Question mark?
No.
Question mark?
Get out of here.
No, get out of here.
To Spencer's point, I think he is totally right. I almost put this slide as just my mind's telling me no, but my body is telling me yeah. Because let me tell you, I know I shouldn't be registering Black Lotus. I want to still. Does not matter. That little brain worm be strong in this head.
Well, Sasha's riding a massive wave of cope from winning a bunch with Doomsday, and I have tried to reverse Brainworm you into picking Doomsday, but I know that it's a high roll deck, and the best of 5 does not suit Doomsday particularly. Also, I think there's going to be 1 to 2 hate bear decks, 1 to 2 blue mid-range, potentially 3 blue mid-range, and then 1 to 2 red aggro disruption decks. So that's not an awesome field for a Breach deck or a Lotus deck or a Doomsday pile to go through, I would say.
100%. Like, in looking at the expected meta, it's not friendly to Doomsday, especially in the context of even a matchup like Mono Red, having played it quite a bit at this point. Despite being positive, it feels extremely 50-50. And my biggest asset going into any sort of match like that is honestly that I'm on the play more than anything else.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I would concede to your knowledge. I know we've kind of worked together a decent amount on the Doomsday list in 2023, and I did bring it to, I think I brought it to 4 tournaments and finals 3 of them and lost all 3 finals.
And the one that you didn't finals, I beat you in round 2.
Yes, correct.
Playing Doomsday Breach as well.
Yes, and I 3-1 that event, but lost to you in round 2. I think Doomsday is like fairly substantially favored against most blue mid-range decks. I think we both went in thinking they were not a good matchup, and as we kind of played more, it's obviously very pilot dependent. Better the pilot, the worse the matchup is, as is with everything. I don't know. I just think that those matchups are actually quite positive, and
Yeah.
if you're expecting multiple people on that, that's a positive for the deck. And the fact that there's almost a 0% chance of there being a mono white Death and Taxes player in the top 8 is a pretty big boon to the deck and the potential for playing it.
Yeah, I do think, having tested this quite a lot, I firmly agree that it's good again. Not just good, it's fantastic into blue mid-range decks. I will happily play that matchup any day of the week. I know some people in the Discord do not feel that way. That's been my experience, and it's particularly subsidized in like specifically the hybrid Doomsday deck, because you have
Yeah.
this density of extra transmute tutors in the 3 CMC transmutes specifically for Doomsday. And what that means is you can oftentimes develop into open mana really safely. You again just have that high redundancy of tutors. So you can play this much slower combo game where you're not planning on actually going off on like turn 3 or turn 4. You're really aiming for like turn 5 to 7. That's where your sweet spot is. And you know, like those kinds of blue mid-range decks, at least locally, they've shifted away from having a very robust creature suite. So you're just given infinite time to develop into that open mana, and you really do benefit from it.
Once you are not just trying to like turbo out your combo and ramming like Doomsday into Daze or a counter spell or something. Oh, rats, I lost. You get so much time in those matchups to hand skull and like look for your silence, look for your chant plus force of will hand. If I was in this top 8, it's what I would be registering, and I
Yeah.
wouldn't even think twice about it. I understand kind of the appeal in wanting to have the ability to like outplay your opponents and get a better matchup spread with a 4-color deck or something.
Yeah. Now, I will pivot to the decks that I think are good against Doomsday Breach and good against combo in general. And I will leave that to the 2 other remaining players.
And yeah, so lastly, we've got this slide makes me laugh. We've got Noel and Spencer, who are the creature combo / aggro dads, and they are trying to cast an elf on turn 1. We know that, or a mox, and after that, they can diverge a bit. So Noel is more looking to beat down. He wants to be playing more aggressive cards for the most part. Did have a nice year in terms of variation on decks. I believe he won with Esper, Blue Black, Naya, and Gruul this year. And he is most well known for playing Gruul, aggro, and I guess Gruul monsters. Like, not, he's playing elves instead of shocks. Like, it's not a red base deck, it's a green base deck. And Naya as well, added initiative creatures and better removal spells, so turning the clock a little slower in return for higher card quality. I think Spencer more likely in terms of playing like the creature combo versions, most notably a win with elves and a win with Seeker Walk. I think Noel actually has a win with Kiki Pod this year already, but I would expect, if I had to guess, Spencer on some sort of Hate Bears deck and Noel on some sort of more aggressively slanted deck. But I know they work together a lot, so I'll let Spencer take the floor.
I mean, I think that's a pretty astute analysis of both of our playstyles. We both definitely like both aggressive creature combo with the mid-range game plan and also disruption-based creature decks for sure. Big Taiga and Savannah enjoyers, I would say we both are. Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a decision process for the tournament. I think going into it, I think both Noel and I's range is pretty similar. We both have played blue, like mid-range decks in other formats and in Highlander, but we both feel far more comfortable on these decks, I'd say. I think looking into this, like the Gruul deck has done extremely well both locally and in other formats. And I think if you look like at the Canada Winter Archive data, you'll see there's still a lot of Gruul decks performing and quite a few Boros decks. So it's really a choice of like if you're going to play a mid-range creature deck like Boros, Gruul, or Naya, which one of those, or potentially like D&T, which of those kind of gets the nod. I think it'd be really difficult for Nolan and I to not register like Llanowar Elves or Birds Paradise, you know.
Yeah, I mean, my reintroduction to Highlander was playing in the national championship or whatever, the event at the face-to-face in Vancouver. Borrowed Noel's Gruul deck and smashed my way to the top 4. And I think if I had to guess, I think Noel will probably lean towards the slightly faster clock, kind of giving up a little bit against combo, but the extra speed against the mid-range decks may be what he's looking for. And I don't know what you're going to do. You'll probably play Natural Order or something. So
I mean, also I think like Noel and I work on a lot of these decks together, like all the Secret Walk and Kiki Pod decks and like the Naya and Gruul decks and stuff. I mean, he is like the papa of the Gruul deck. And actually that's the one archetype me and him don't agree on a lot. We don't agree on its matchup analysis, and we also don't agree on a lot of the card choices. But we agree a lot on the Naya archetype, which is every conversation with Noel and I is always just like a Boros, Selesnya, Gruul argument. And then eventually we're just like, well, maybe we should just splash the third color. I think it's pretty safe to say that neither of us will probably play Secret Walk. Much like I don't think Thomas will play Secret Walk. It's definitely a possibility, but I actually think it's pretty poorly positioned into this meta because you don't really have a good matchup. And that deck is one that I feel like you either go walls mana heavy for your early game drops, like you're kind of cantripping with like Wall of Blossoms, Wall of Omens kind of stuff, which helps you against the mono red decks. But then if you don't have removal or some good mid-range threats or some like cheap interaction or recursive threats, then it's difficult to balance out the blue mid-range or like aggro mid-range decks. And honestly, that deck I've played quite a few times against mono red or red aggressive decks, and it never feels good because you're soft to your mana getting destroyed. You're soft to like all removal, and your combo's soft removal. Not good. I've played a lot of natural order decks this year, with Cradlehoof, old school Cradlehoof, Cradle Control, and Elves, and one with a couple of them. This top 8 is extremely hostile to a Cradle deck, I would say. Or specifically a natural order deck. I was trying to test a couple like more Cradle Control versions that are more of like a mid-range shell as opposed to more of like a just drawing a bunch of cards and casting card off me with. Considering that like basically 5 or 6 of these decks are going to have a high level removal and there's one dedicated combo deck with a Tabernacle, I don't feel good about that as an option.
Yeah, I think Spencer, your analysis on Secret Walk being a bad choice is spot on. It's kind of the like it's the more viable go big creature deck, having a combo opposed to like ramping into a very big threat to close out the game. And this meta is just extremely hostile to it. And I'd be surprised if you or Thomas or Noel, any of you, decided to show up with honestly any varietal of creature combo. The one thing that has been interesting in terms of the like deck choices, I've always felt like green red monsters in particular has had a good matchup against 4-color blue mid-range decks. And I mean that specifically like the Omniscitive style, even when you're playing Moxen and Mana Dorks and the like most robust threats that you can, because you have such a high density of these like the Initiative and Monarchy, where you need to actually hold it for a certain period of time. Gruul is really good at punishing that. It is a deck with an enormous number of trample haste creatures. It plays a fairly good density of removal. It also, despite the Omniscitive deck being pretty safe from Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon, it still gets hammered by Price of Progress, and Gruul is one of the decks that can play it to the most efficient level. And even Blood Moon can sometimes get you because they can ramp out a threat so fast. And in that context, Moon becomes a less of a prison piece and more of a this is going to stall you for a turn or like lock out a certain number of things in your hand. And that delay is actually much more deadly than the complete lockout.
I definitely think like Gruul and Boros both have like quite good hate bear mixes for like a lot of the matches in this top 8, and a lot of it has to do with their non-basic land hate package, which I think is quite strong. And I think this is a top 8 where like I think the RDW deck's like positioned to just cast Price Progress and like win most of the games it gets to successfully cast that. And by extension, I also think that a Resolve Blood Moon is going to be quite strong in a bunch of matchups.
Great. Now that you've said that non-basic hate is crucial to these decks, I need to go to the next slide.
I can't wait.
So a nice quote from Naya Dad Noel. Naya is just wannabe omniscitive. Great quote and great enlightenment. Or enlightenment, as Sasha has advised us.
We were going far. We were going fast. I'm sorry.
You know, Noel had to bug Ben Wheeler to post his Naya deck because he like me and him been working on a bunch of Naya decks. So he kept winning with it, and then I won with one. And I remember Noel was like, just post my deck list. Naya is a good deck. And because Ben had kept tweeting that Naya was like one of the worst color combos besides Mardu. But two of those have been the most winning archetypes this year, just saying. At Ben Wheeler doesn't know.
I do think Naya is a very good deck, and it's obviously Noel's like peak comfort level deck. But also, I'm glad he's finally achieved his enlightenment in recognizing that Omniscience is just the like Naya is the halfway step between Great Red Monsters and Omniscience, and opposed to having one foot in the door on either side and not having a firm identity. I think it is better to just choose one of the two. So that leaves these two.
This is my
This is the Charlie slide right here.
this is the brain rot that me and Noel kind of go through when we decide to play one of these decks or Naya. I kind of imagined the metagame as RDW, Mardu, Jessica Green combo lands, Jessica D&T, Boros Seeker, potential decks and ranges. These kind of led me to get off Boros. I consider like Gruul to have a good RDW match. I think Gruul has a bad Mardu match. I think Gruul has a slightly good Jessica Green. I think it's like a 52-55 kind of match. Gruul is a dog against combo. I think Gruul beats lands. I think Gruul beats Jessica Control, depending on the build. I think Gruul beats D&T. I think Gruul beats Boros. And I think Gruul actually loses to Seeker. I think Boros loses to Reddick wins. I think Boros and Mardu pretty close. I think Boros is a slight dog to Jessica Green. I think Boros beats combo. I think Boros beats lands. I think Boros loses Jessica Control. I think Boros beats D&T as well. I think Boros loses Scroll, and I think Boros beats Seeker. Basically, these would make this is just my opinion. And Noel's opinion. Prove us at us. Disagree with us all you want, but that's based on playing those matches quite a bit. And I would say that of these two decks, I'm more likely to go Gruul, but it would be pretty difficult for me to not register Savannah. So or Plains of some sort. So I definitely won't be registering Boros. I just think it's just gonna lose to some of the matchups that I think I'll be on the draw to, and particularly the Boros builds, although they've been placing well a lot in the online meta and other metas. And I quite like Boros as an archetype. It's just reliant on fast mana and quick mana so much. You are just so dead to counter magic. Whereas Gruul's fast mana in the forms of mana dorks means that its acceleration is kind of slower, but it's not as gotcha'd by a daze or a force of will. So any sort of permission doesn't feel as bad against it. Plus the threats out of it are each like an individual game winner, whereas a lot of the Boroses are not. And I also think that there might be a little less combo. So Gruul does look like a really strong contender for a choice. I also think suffers a bit from needing a few more cards in the 3-drop slot.
Yeah, and I will say this, seeing the brain rot that is the Naya chat and your guys' analysis on Green Red versus Boros, it does present this interesting dynamic where like if me and Robin are alternating between like Jeskai Green / 4-color mid-range piles and Black Lotus decks, and you guys are oscillating between Gruul and Boros, there is this fun rock, paper, scissors where like I think Jeskai Green is very good against Boros, but is probably even to like at least Omniscience has a tougher time against Gruul. And then contrast to that, the Black Lotus decks are good against Gruul and then pretty horrible, honestly, into Boros.
Weirdly enough, in one way, I do think like D&T would be a dog to whichever deck Noel and I play, I feel, but would be good against some of the other decks in the meta. It's a deck that like I historically played a ton of, but haven't really picked up lately. It's definitely a deck I thought about, but I have a deep-seated resistance to playing a monocolored deck that isn't green. So I don't know, difficult to do. I just think that in Noel and I's kind of expected top 4 metagame in an ideal outcome scenario, not like because I always think it's important to project yourself into a winning circle, not necessarily that you win. I think that sets you up for like disappointment necessarily, but you should always be fairly confident. And my like goal is to make it at least into the top 4 for myself. And I mean, like, ideally it'd be like nice to win or get in the finals, but I expect like or myself to try and get into at least the top 4, hopefully, and potentially finals. And because of that, like my expected winners metagame, I think that affects also my deck choice as well.
Can I quickly ask you, Spencer, when you were going through this and you found Mardu, are you talking specifically about like Jason's tokens deck or a more general Mardu build?
I'm thinking of Jason's token deck. I mean, it's taking like several different builds, but I'd say like generally speaking, the Mardu tokens is like what I consider like the Mardu archetype as a whole.
Okay, and you feel that Gruul has a tough time into that?
Yeah, I think it does. Because partially if it's the removal heavy portion of his deck, the fast mana. So in the same way that Boros hits the board with, double lands, Moxen, and Lotus Petals and other sorts of, cheap mana, Mardu does the same thing with a wide spread of Moxen and other fast mana sources. Unlike Gruul, where Gruul has to develop with off of an elf, Mardu has a good chance actually on the draw against Gruul because they'll actually break serve with the fast mana before Gruul's able to. I mean, Gruul still has Moxen draws obviously too, but generally speaking, they don't necessarily get them as much as like the decks are playing 4 to 7 cheat sources as opposed to 2. In that way, also Mardu has access to the white removal. And one of the things about the Gruul matchups is they're very like, although their threats are quite heavy, they're also typically dead to white removal. Whereas decks that go a little bit wider aren't necessarily like if they have 2 or 3 like strong threats on board, whereas Gruul often only has like one really big one, and it's hoping to draw into like its second planeswalker or second haymaker, because it's not necessarily a tutor heavy build. With the Mardu deck, having access to lots of cheap removal and unconditional removal is usually able to A, bolt the bird, so to speak, or bolt the relevant threat, and then they just kind of kill you with the 1/1s. Gruul has parts of its deck, like obviously it has a Pyro or Fury draw that can like wipe a bit of the board, but as we've all seen, like the Mardu deck's kind of resilient to that and has its own nut draws with Onoda. So I don't know. It's a bit of a toss-up match. If anything, I think it's more like a 55-45, but that's, like I said, that's my opinion. I think Nolan, I don't necessarily agree on that, but he definitely doesn't feel good about it. That matchup's just really, it's the same thing with like the Mardu versus the D&T matchups, like extremely poor too. Decks in the creature mirrors, decks that do synergy-based things, particularly if it's a mid-range creature mirror, perform overly well. And the thing with the Mardu deck is not only does it have a lot of the synergy-based like card draw, anthems, tokens, make your removal bad, their removal quite good. They can chump a lot of your things. But then if they just draw the mid-range part of their plan, like the Winotas and the Guts and the Rebel Masters, those are also quite difficult to deal with. So it's
Yeah,
just
because Gruul doesn't have the same density of removal that lots of other decks get access to.
correct. And it really wants to save its removal for the threats that matter. And unfortunately, it can get swarmed by a bunch of 1/1 flyers that have an anthem. A bunch of 2/2 flyers will kill a Gruul deck quite fast, particularly if they make it stumble. One of the interesting things, and like this perspective also is from playing a lot of Maverick and D&T and Legacy, decks that are and to also in our format lands, decks that are attempting to strip mine waste you or to play a mana denial plan against you are often also super susceptible to being mana screwed themselves. If you bolt or strip or waste a Gruul player, or most of these other like low to the curve like mana denial decks, like even D&T, like it can really screw up their whole thing and really inhibit their development on the board.
I think the Boros or Boros or Gruul are pretty good. They do open up this interesting problem where like if you want to think about decks that could punish both of those and the rest of the meta as well, it really does point to like there are some off the wall options that could exist. Like if you want a way to punish the like 4-color blue mid-range things while having a very robust combo plan, like Timebolt definitely comes to mind, particularly like the 4-color no red version, playing all the constructs and then just having access to one of the premier 2-card 7-point combos in the format.
Timebolt's actually specifically Jeskai Timebolt, the one that won the face-to-face Vancouver, I think Joking has a list that's quite good, has been a deck that I'm considering for this top-8 actually, but it goes against my reps with deck philosophy. I think Jeskai Timebolt or a Timebolt deck is uniquely positioned to do quite well. And I also think that the 2 players that would play cards that hate you out are unlikely to play Collector Oof. I think that actually Timebolt's pretty well positioned.
All right, you say that, but I think I know you're showing up with Collector Oof, so that's not an issue. I do think one of the this is a real off-the-wall pick, so listeners may not know that Victoria has a very aggro-centric metagame. We also have like a pretty robust set of mid-range decks that play these larger threats at like 4 toughness, maximize the use of the 3 mana sweepers like Anger of the Gods, Slag Storm, Brotherhood's End. If you found a deck that could,
my language.
If there was a way to like find some kind of mid-range pile that could register all those cards, that would be good against obviously Jason's deck, RDW, pretty much any deck that Noel or Spencer you register, but could also still have a good matchup into 4-color mid-range or lands, that would be an interesting spot. And I weirdly think Scapeshift might fit that very particular bill. I'm not a huge fan of that deck in general. I'm actually extremely low on it on the whole. But I think for this particular metagame, it might be weirdly viable in a way that I think it conventionally is less well suited to do.
I think Scapeshift has long been 4-color Scapeshift is the one I'm thinking of, obviously Splashing Black. There's been a no red version I've seen online going around. I just don't like the versions that don't win the turn they cast Scapeshift. But one thing I think that's really important with the Scapeshift decks, and I think you hit the nail on the point, Sash, is that that is a deck where I think if you bring it to a 5-round tournament, like a Monday Night Highlander, 5 or 6 rounds sometimes, or like you are likely to have one terrible match. I think that most of the decks we've actually talked this top 8, there's a lot of 55-45s. Like they're pretty close. I'd say almost like play draw mulligan dependent a lot of the time, and obviously player difference. Scapeshift is one of those decks, and there's a few of them in the format that's actually feels like it has 60-40s. Like to both ways, where it's like it's got some real stinking matchups, and then it's got some that I think are quite strong in its favor. And yeah, I think there's like a rug taking turns version or a 4-color black version that could be quite good going to this, but it would require someone to have like tuned it quite well, and I think that would be unlikely to happen at this point. You're gonna do it, Sasha. You should do it for the boys.
I think tuning it to beat everything but 4-color mid-range would be possible. I think tuning that deck to be good against specifically like 4-color mid that Thomas and I suspect Robin will bring is gonna be a losing battle. And the way the kind of density of counterspells you need to include in it to make it on anywhere near the realm of reasonable against Storm, if Robin chooses to bring that, I think is kind of way too high, honestly, to make it a real consideration. But it's definitely one on my radar, and I might show up to a Monday night to at least give it a go and see how the vibes are, if you will.
For sure. We're going to kind of pivot a little bit here, and we're going to be wrapping up fairly soon, but we are going to always take the time at the end of every podcast, just kind of give some shout outs to winners of larger scale events and events that are reported either mostly through the Discord or Yellow Jacket tournaments. But as we get more and more metagames, so if you're deck sharing and you're reporting your tournaments on Discord, you may get a shout out going forward. Our local Yellow Jacket tournament this week was taken down by none other than co-host Sasha Christensen, Doomsday Breach, the most broken deck in Highlander. Fake applause entered here.
The deck slaps so hard, and it has when Spencer's talking about there's very few decks with 60-40 matchups, this deck feels like it's 60-40 against close to everything, unless that person's putting hate bears into play, in which case you're that 40%.
Yeah, absolutely. Still my favorite deck in the format for sure.
Yeah, and I do want to get on a soapbox for a second here. The good old Discord. I learned the other day they are registering cards in Canadian Highlander named Blood Pet and Wild Cantor in their Underworld Breach combo decks. And I have come here on this podcast that I co-host to say there is a better way. You can play a second combo in your deck that is far more resilient and does not require you to register such bad cards as Blood Pet. And you'll notice from this fine Venn diagram how Doomsday and Breach have a lot of asymmetry in the kind of hate that gets them. And the hate that hits both of them is either less played or honestly was always going to get you anyways. So what's the worry? I cannot state enough how robust Doomsday has felt as an addition to the deck. I'm annoyed it took me so long to realize that it was something we could just do in the format. Even just last night, having access to both halves of the kill mattered a lot, and the ability to pivot between each one depending on the matchup, and to be able to mulligan aggressively for a specific kill if you knew one was going to be vulnerable was just such a huge asset in all of my matches. I won't go any further, just go to CanadianHighlander.ca and read the primer on it. It's a great deck, and more people who want to play Storm should be playing this deck instead.
So from here, we're going to throw it over to Spencer I can't believe it. It is 2024 and Grandma Pattern Rector has made the finals of the Discord webcam tournament. So
Yeah.
I know Spencer is either crying with joy or doing something we can't say on a kid-friendly podcast when he sees that picture. So take it away before things get ugly.
I just want to shout out Fry Guy playing Pattern Rector, top 2ing, bringing it back. Sandy B, almost a forgotten grandma, never survived, always a bridesmaid. In classic Sandy B fashion, I didn't notice until just now, but they actually came in second and not first, so that makes sense. True Sandy B. Sandy B's like I think someone mentioned this, but Sandy B is one of like those Canlander icon decks, I feel, where it's associated with the format. There's a bunch of them, but this is one of them that I feel is more associated with the meme than it actually being a good deck, and I kind of like that as well. And as an OG progenitor of the OG version in the early 2010s, I think the deck's gotten so much better in terms of card quality, and yet so much worse as the card quality of other decks and archetypes has gone through the roof comparatively. Let's look at Fragai's list here. Yep, he's on or they are on a natural order plan. They got some Atraxa action, which is kind of interesting for the Pruning Hulk. Also Titania with a bit of a strip point spread. Got DT, strip, survival, natural order vamp. Good tutor, lots of hate bears. Notably, their pile does not include, like they do have a similar to the Flash, which is a much better deck. Their Pruning Hulk pile usually wins now with a Samwise chain, looping Calder Familiar. So obviously, we're going to follow that. We're going to hit them with the Ginger Brute. We're going to get some foods. We're not going to be as soft to Graveyard Hate anymore, except that we're still soft to it on the Academy Rector trigger. But hey, we're not talking about how this deck's not good. You know, we got a Cutzel, which I like. I think I'd rather have Grand Abolisher. Although one thing I've often talked to other Sandy pilots, and there's been many, is that the mana of this deck has always been kind of bad, which is interesting for a 3-color green-based deck. The pip density of your combo pieces, and especially the turns you're trying to go off with protection, be that like hand attack, usually requires you to either have exposed your sack outlet for black or be casting black plus a high CMC card or recurring it out of your graveyard, and that usually just doesn't go well. I think that cards like the One Ring prefer like clear versions where you're just kind of all going on the combo, and then your backup mid-range plan is either hitting them with your hate bears or blinking initiative or unearthing initiative cards, which I think most creature combo decks have kind of moved towards. Their game plan is try and do the combo. If the combo doesn't look like it's going to get through it, just play initiative, because you usually have enough derpy creature cards to either control the initiative or help protect it. And yeah, Sandy B. Now, many of the dominant decks are either white exile based or have like 3 to 4 graveyard removal effects. No, and this isn't even like talking about like cards like Endurance or anything like that. Like, it's gone by the wayside. I think it's a difficult deck to finish with, but I think it's a great coming in second deck, or great X1 deck for sure.
Big props to Fraggai for doing well with this deck, that every week I show up to Highlander, I take such great delight in not registering.
You know what? We need to go back to like an old version where you're blinking Siege Rhinos or something as your backup plan. Stop playing initiative, just take a bold course of action.
I remember, sorry, this was the first deck, and honestly the only deck in paper that I had completely built for Highlander for many years. And I remember so many weeks where I would just lose to like Wheeler or Patty B playing the first edition of the Seeker Walk deck before Ephemery got printed, using cards like Deceiver Exarch and like Birthing Pot and Reanimate to recursively return that Time Walk and loop. And I remember just thinking, wow, this deck sucks so much in comparison to that deck. And so years later, every single week, again, great delight in never having to register this deck again. But I give infinite props to Fraggai.
Yeah, I think one of the things about this deck too, the test of time and the points list, like even as we took points off Protean Hulk to try and maybe inject some juice into this once much beloved archetype, it's just the points don't really like align for it. It really wants like a fast mana spread, but it also really wants the tutors. It's hard for it to get the necessary requisite tutors. And it's in a similar boat as lands, where even if you have fast mana and tutors, you're still kind of slow. Because you need to kind of get ahead on board early. Like, your big combo turns are often like heavy mana turns. If you're trying to play with protection. I mean, if you're just trying to go for it, obviously you can just get there sometimes. But typically you want to save for a turn where you can like cast some sort of hand attack or have some sort of hate bear in play that inhibits your opponent's ability to interact with a combo. So that can be a big mana turn. And obviously, like, opponents aren't usually just sitting there doing nothing, except for when your opponent plays Doomsday, and then it always seems like they just diddle themselves for the entire time.
It's tough because I'm not sure what the card that would get printed that would make this deck good, and that's a tough thing to say.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, I thought with the kind of the changing of the Protean Hulk pile would help quite a bit, but once again, like, the difficulties of like all the Protean Hulk decks is you have to play some pretty mopey cards in your deck, and any sack deck that's not like an aristocrat style deck where it's like really getting a huge onboard advantage for that, then you have not dead draws, but like not great draws and all your mana ramp elves. You have other like top end stuff, which is also difficult, and then you have the ways to recur your loop. So, some versions are playing like activated sleepers or karmic guides to help protect your loops or, cause other loops. You just end up having lots of like poor hands essentially with this deck is the problem, because your top end of the combo is like hard to cast, and your lower mid combo is kind of at odds with each other, where you really need to draw particular cards. You really need to have the mana ramp. It can really suffer from drawing one half your deck syndrome, and it's not blue, so you don't get the card selection.
None of us are registering this for the top 8. That's what I'm hearing.
I'm just going to touch on a deck that near and dear to me. We have Nathan Lepitz. I might be pronouncing that wrong. With a win at the Connection bi-weekly event. Doesn't say how many players. So I know some of the Vancouver events were starting to get a decent amount of players, though. So hopefully this is one of them. Playing Grixis Tempo. This is a pretty interesting list. Probably shares upwards of 80 cards with the deck I probably played the most last year and had a reasonable amount, probably unfortunately for the archetype, the most success of anyone with. It was not a great year for tempo decks or kind of lower to the ground blue decks. This is an interesting list. I did try Grixis for a couple weeks and I didn't love it. I think there's some cool card includes here. And I will say I think I played Grixis before Lord of the Rings came out. So this deck getting access to Bowmasters, to Molten Collapse, and Sauron's Ransom, which I know we're not all super high on, but it is a playable black magic card. Yeah, I think archetype is still good. Struggles in metagames that are very initiative heavy. I found getting the initiative back to be very difficult when I was playing blue-red, and I don't know that the black adds a lot to it. But you are going to go underneath a lot of the 4-color piles, and these versions in particular, I think, are good against combo because you have a good density of low to the ground creatures to back up your counterspell suite. And I will say the one thing I would really like in this list is the wombo combo of Troll of Kel'Thuzad and Reanimate. I really like Reanimate in these lists, especially when you're playing like Fury and some good hate bear type cards like Bowmaster's Opposition Agent, even reanimating Snapcaster Mage and bringing back Reanimate. Yeah, really high on Reanimate when you are on the light black splash. But other than that, list looks cool. It is playing Price of Progress, and I guess it's got 8 basics, 9 basic. A lot of kind of that stood out to me too, but could have like a very lands focused metagame or something. So shout out to Nathan. Love the deck. Glad you got a W with it. And yeah, I will probably be playing something similar when I return next month.
One thing about the tempo decks, I think they're so strong, especially considering that they often have like a very aggressive CMC. Like in the last few years, they've seen so many cards printed for them that turn like into like they can play a finisher as early as like turn 2 or 3 and with like counter backup, right? I don't know why there's been like kind of a hole in the metagame with these.
I found didn't 3-1 once out of like 7 events or something I played with it. But I feel like this is a weird thing to say and it's like total cope, but I feel like you're very at risk of being high rolled when you play decks like this because your game plan is built around gaining incremental advantages throughout the early and mid game. And so if someone just like plays Mana Crypt on turn 1, you're just basically dead. Like you'll just never win that game because the amount of advantage that they're going to gain from that Mana Crypt and casting multiple high density cards early in the game is just really hard to overcome. So that was the reason why I put it down, because our metagame did kind of skew towards high roll magic for quite a while and like putting initiative creatures into play on turn 1 and 2 kind of thing.
Yeah, just on this note, one of my more off the wall, it's not really off the wall, one of my secondary picks for a blue mid-range deck has been like check mid-range, which does not on its surface seem like a big difference from Omniscitive and like the kind of Jeskai green piles. But the thing you really notice when you've actually put that deck together is how condensed its curve is. Like, you can play it extremely low to the ground, and I feel like that's one of the best ways to play it. It's also a deck that can play low to the ground with Recall in its spread, and it plays Recall really effectively because it gets access to Tainted Pact as well. And I feel like that's an archetype that can both have a very good matchup against the kind of going bigger blue decks because of its access to black and cards like Mind Twist, the Hand Attack that complements it, cards like Leovold. Like you're actually pretty well suited to address those cards. And because you have this good density of black removal that is really tempo positive, even if it does cost you a lot of life, cards like Snuff Out, cards like Fire Covenant, I think that you can make the like specifically Gruul matchup winnable. And so it's definitely one of the ones that I'm considering in my repertoire of 4-color blue mid-range decks.
I think Check Battle is really good. I've always thought it's a really good deck. I just think it gets pushed out by like the aggro creature decks sometimes. Because if you hedge too much for the blue mid-range matchups, which it can definitely be like highly advantaged in, it just like gets rolled by a red aggressive deck.
Yeah, it's definitely one that's going to struggle more into RDW than Gruul.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a good pick, and I think people picking up decks in the format that are blue players generally want to go more colors rather than less, just to kind of showcase and play more powerful spells. But I do think the like Murktide Delver style deck does still have a lot of play to it in either blue-red or Grixis, and it's gotten some new tools in the last couple sets too that I'm excited to try.
I think that's a wrap, folks.
That's a wrap. Yeah, that's it. We got in a sturdy time this time. If you have any suggestions or things you would like us to deep dive or look into, by all means, you can hit us individually up on the Discord. You can hit us up on Twitter at CJ Highlander 1. I know, not the best name, but it was the best I could do. Or just reply in the comments on the YouTube video. We will be trying to get audio only, like podcast, into Spotify and iTunes ASAP. So we're just in the process of doing that as well. So thanks to everyone, and good luck to you gentlemen in the tournament.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully see you there next year, bud.
Yeah, I don't know. I keep giving myself a 4-month lack of head start because I don't start playing till like April. But maybe I'll convert like 25% of my finals this year and coast in easily.
All right, see you guys next time.
Have a good one.